Good morning. Thank you, Jamal. So no one told Eric's legs that the sun is out. So if someone could, yeah. Anyway, good morning. We are going to do things a little bit differently. Hopefully it works and hopefully you like it. A couple of things that I did want to share with you before we get into the message and worship. One, thanks largely to you. Thanks largely to Real Life Church. Our missions trip is fully funded, so thank you so much. That is incredible. We have had some support from outside, but this has been a very generous church, very generous time for us, and I just really very much appreciate it that we can really have more project money than anticipated to really do a lot of work and maybe leave some money behind for the Bates in Bangladesh. So we're going to be, I think, a very real blessing to them and to the work they're doing there. So thank you so much for coming alongside us and being Ascending Church. That means a lot. I am excited to hear about Beth's message. It's a very courageous thing for her to do, and I think it's going to be great. The Goodins aren't here because Beth's brother, in case you don't know, is a pastor in Rochester, and today is his last day. Her brother is transitioning to a role of leadership in the district, so they're down there with the Khalees's to celebrate his last day. He's done a tremendous job down there at that church, a church that had a lot of just some issues, some challenges, and Jim Philbeck has done a fantastic job. So they're down there celebrating him today, so that's why they're not here. So they have left the service in the hands of the unpaid pastor. So you get what you pay for. So we'll see how it goes. We are going to do some things a little differently. Just to explain, I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to worship. Then I'm going to talk, and then we'll worship a little bit. We're going to kind of go back and forth throughout this theme. The theme of the morning is looking to Jesus. Looking to Jesus. So hopefully we have an experience of that this morning. Michelle and I have been, so Michelle works with the kids and the families. I oversee missions, but we have had the pleasure and the honor of leading a college and young adult life group this past year. And it's been fantastic. If you don't know, I've worked in higher ed for a long time. I love college students. And so we've had some of them in our home this past year. So Adam, Esther, Micah, Allie, Spencer, Serena, and Constance have been coming most of the year, pretty much every other week, eating our food, and it's been wonderful. We've had a great time with them. The past few meetings, we transitioned from the conversations we were having to watching and discussing videos from Mark Batterson's book, Whisper. And that book is about kind of making space to hear from God, making space to hear the whisper of God's voice. Now, I will tell you that this may resonate with only a portion of you, but I know that some of you, when you come here to church, when we get to the worship set, you just don't feel it. You don't want to worship. You don't feel like doing it. It feels insincere. You feel like you're lying. You feel like everyone else is on this spiritual high and you're just not, so why are you even here? It can be very hard. I have spoken to people who lead worship, and they say sometimes they are charged with leading, and they also feel that same way. So how can I lead people in worship when I don't want to be here, right? How can I do that? It can be hard to worship. It can be a challenging experience. We often don't feel it. We often are distracted by our doubts, our fears, our concerns, our worries. Life hasn't stopped simply because we walked through the doors. So years ago, I was wrestling with this. In 6th grade, I was voted most sincere, which is like, thanks for coming. You're not cool, but, not going to go anywhere. But you're sincere. We appreciate that. As if 6th graders know what that means. I think I was also best dancer, which, that's true. So I value sincerity, I value authenticity. I want to come to worship, something that should be some of my truest moments of the week, and be real, be honest. And yet sometimes I don't feel like doing that. Years ago, I was wrestling with this and trying to help myself understand that and help some of the students I was working with. And this this story came to mind, the story of Jesus, in Luke 19, 36 through 40. It says this: As he rode along, they spread their cloaks on the road. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen, saying, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. In this scene, Jesus is going to Jerusalem. He's going to die, and he knows that. Many people don't, but he knows that. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. And Jesus answered this, I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. I remember reading that passage thinking, well, wow, what does that say about God? God will be worshiped. Jesus will be worshiped by his creation. That's going to happen. I get the choice to enter in or not enter in. Who he is does not change, despite how I feel at that moment. How I feel is irrelevant. It's true, but it's small t truth, right? It's lowercase. It isn't true in the sense of who he is. So you get stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? How can I be sincere, and yet these rocks are going to cry out? And I thought this, Jake, don't get beat by a rock, right? And so I come to worship sometimes and I say, Lord, I don't feel like it. I don't know if you exist. If you exist, I don't know if you care. If you care, I don't know if I care. I just don't know right now. Help me. Help me, right? Help me. And I let God speak into that authentic, wounded, desperate, lonely place. And then he responds and allows me to worship him in the middle of all of that. That isn't going to connect with some of you, but there might be a couple here that say, yeah, I've been there. And I wanted to leave that with you as we enter into worship. So the Bible, I think, is full of some great stories and some weird stories. And certainly some of them are more descriptive than prescriptive. Like, here's something that happened. Don't do that thing, but just so you know this happened. Let's talk about what was bad about that. There's those kinds of stories. There are some that are prescriptive. Here's an example of a good thing. Do that thing. And then there's some just, I think, some odd ones. And so we're going to talk about that today. Talk about one of them at least. Numbers 21, 4 through 9 reads like this. From Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient on the way, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. So they've been wandering, and this worthless food is the manna. God had provided manna, and they're upset about it. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. And the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So when he looks at the serpent that I've made, they'll live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole, and if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. So here is the scene. The Israelites have been wandering in the desert for a long time. I have not been to Israel. I know a couple of, who's been to Israel? A few of you? I know some have. It's fantastic. I've not been there. Michelle got to go a few years ago. It was a fantastic experience. One of the things that struck her was this space where Israelites are wandering is not that big. They're wandering around a relatively small space. Under the Lord's guidance, he had his purposes. But they've been wandering. Shortly before this scene, Moses' wife, Miriam, had died, and Aaron, Moses' right-hand man and the chief priest, had died as well. So they're grieving, and it's been hard. In their wandering, they're approaching the land of Edom, but the king of Edom would not let them pass through. He said, no, you've got to walk around. Well, we won't take anything. We won't take water from your wells. We won't take any of your food or your crops. We just want to go through. The king said no. Now, Edom means red, and the Edomites were descendants of Esau. Esau and Jacob were brothers, right? And they didn't get along. And so there's some strife and some enmity between the two nations, Jacob being the father of Israel. So they just don't like the Israelites. There's also many of them, so there's probably some fear. Like, if these people walk through and change their mind or break their agreement with us to not take our water or our crops, then we've got some trouble. So no, you can't walk through. Instead, the Israelites are being forced to go around Edom and through Kadesh. This is a harsh and dry land. Now, lots of Israel, a lot of the land is harsh and dry. This is particularly harsh and dry. The Israelites do not want to walk through Kadesh. Through this wandering, they are confronted by King Arad, who takes some of the Israelites captive. They must fight to reclaim their stolen people. And on the way out of Edom toward the Red Sea, they become impatient and made a familiar complaint. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Why can't we just go back to the slavery? At least we had some food. For there's no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food, they say. Again, worthless food, referring to manna. It was a sweet bread given only to the Israelites. God's special provision for his special people he was calling and preparing to be a light to the world. But they weren't getting it. They weren't understanding what was going on. It's another example of God's people forgetting prior and immediate blessings because of present circumstances, right? Yes, you did this thing in the past, but what about now? I know it was Christmas yesterday, but I want a present today. We've been there, right? The wandering was difficult, and the land was harsh. God's judgment didn't come because of that. That wasn't his judgment. That was his preparation. God's judgment came because his people forgot his provision and grace time and time again. Many scholars, there's kind of an age-old, thought, idea about the stories of Israelites, that the Jews are like regular people, except more so. They're like everyone else except more so. We see these kind of caricatured versions of the things that we do day to day. And so the fiery serpents were sent, and the Israelites were given a cure to the pain. Moses made a bronze serpent and lifted it up on a pole for all Israel to see. It would be placed in a spot where if you were bit, you could look at this bronze serpent, this thing, and God would cure you. It was right there in the middle of camp. By looking in faith to the serpent that Moses had made and lifted up, God would cure them of the snake venom. Healing came not through the serpent, but through the act of faith, right? It was like a director's fingers. I'm looking here to frame in, not my fingers, but what's important, right? It was a guide to the next thing. This is about that. This thing is about that thing. But then fast forward, many years later, in 2 Kings, the Israelites have lost their way, and they've begun to follow other gods, and they've messed things up, and they've kind of merged their Jewish faith, their faith in God, with other religions. 2 Kings 18:4 says this: He removed the high places, speaking of Hezekiah, and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah. And he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan. So Hezekiah came in and he realizes, he learns, we've lost our way. We need to worship God and we need to get rid of all these things. And so he begins to tear down these things. But God had given them the bronze serpent. So why would he tear that down? Well, because the Israelites had begun to worship that. It had become an idol for them. As opposed to something that would get them to focus on the real thing, it had become the object of their worship instead. Now, the word Nehushtan sounds like the Hebrew words for bronze and serpent, but it also become kind of a slang word and kind of a derogatory term. The Israelites gradually missed the point. It was God who had given them the serpent as an avenue of healing and respite. The serpent was meant to be like I said, like the director's fingers, but they lost focus on the main thing, and instead they worshiped the serpent. Now, we may say we would never do that, but I do think sometimes when we wear crosses, right, that becomes sort of a good luck charm. I'm wearing this, I'm good. I've even gone to worship, and I'm good, right? I have worshiped, I've sung the songs, and therefore I am blessed God will bless me. God will guide me. Sometimes worship becomes more cathartic and emotional release than an offering given to God. We sometimes lose our way. We miss the point. The cross is a symbol of curse and shame. It's not a lucky rabbit's foot. When we worship the bronze serpent, when we worship things that are meant to point us to something else, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. What of church attendance? Do we sometimes come to church, see, I'm a good Christian, I've come to church. I've got it right. I might even volunteer. Those are good things. Coming to church, worshiping, tithing, being engaged with ministries in church are good things, but why am I doing it? Why am I doing it? It strikes me that sometimes we miss the point, or we forget the point. The thing, the guide that becomes the object of our worship, and the thing will always disappoint. And then we miss out on the blessing of relationship with the loving, graceful, and present God.
Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace.
If I had to pick patron saints or favorite characters of the Bible, of Scripture, I would pick Peter and Thomas. They would almost always be at the top of my list. We saw a video earlier of N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright and Paul of the Bible are Michelle's crushes, so I can't compete with that, so I go the other direction. I would pick Peter because he's so sincere and he's willing. I often wish I were less cautious and willing to risk more. He went for it. He just went for it. And somehow he became the leader of the disciples. And I don't know if that's because, well, he won't shut up, so let's just, is that why he's recorded? Or was it appointed? I don't know. But he seems to be the guy that is recorded the most. He's speaking the most. He's engaged. He is going after Jesus wholeheartedly, though he gets it wrong. Thomas is actually similar, though less often with his foot in his mouth, at least as far as we can tell. But how do we describe Thomas? What do we call him? Doubting Thomas, right? Doubting Thomas. We call him that because, I'll read this passage. John 20, 24 and 25. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will never believe." Many of us are familiar with this scene from John 20. Jesus has come. He's taught them a new way, and then he's died. And he's predicted that, but it's still very confusing. And they're scared. And then 3 days later, he's discovered the tomb is empty. And he appears to some women, right? And they come back and they tell the story. And then he appears to some in the room where his followers are gathering. But Thomas isn't there. And so they told him about this. "Thomas, Jesus is risen. He's back." "We'll see. We'll see," he says. Thomas is struggling with this. I think doubt and grief can look a lot alike. Perhaps Thomas was simply guarding his heart. Not his best moment for sure. One he probably regretted. But I think his doubt and grief were mixed together. He loved Jesus, and now Jesus is gone, and he's afraid. He's so scared is what I was looking for. That doesn't work. But he's scared. Faith doesn't always look like we want it to, or maybe like it should. I don't know. I don't know exactly how faith should look. I know sometimes I'm dissatisfied with how it does look for me. In Thomas, we see he's still there with the disciples. He's still waiting to see, but he's reserved, right? So his faith and his doubt and his grief are all mixed together. What some of you may not know about Thomas, I know it took me a long time and a lot of time of reading over these stories before I connected these simple dots. In John 11:16, it says this, "Let us go that we may die with him." In this scene, Jesus is out doing his thing, and he's heard his friend Lazarus. Lazarus was special to Jesus. He's heard Lazarus is sick. And he says, "I want to go to see Lazarus." His disciple says, "No, we can't go to Jerusalem because there's some Jews there and they want to stone you. They're going to kill you. If you go to Jerusalem, they're going to kill you. We can't do that." And Jesus, insists, and it's kind of hard to win an argument with Jesus. So they're going to go. Thomas's response is this: "Let us go that we may die with him." Now, is that a person whose whole being, his character, can be summed up with doubting? I don't think so. I think that's a guy I'd like to be more like, right? That's a guy who I understand. He's all in and yet sad. He's scared about it, but he's all in. He's going for it. We see that doubt, grief, struggle, bold faith, and desperate commitment can exist in the same heart. We can worship and question. Like having cold feet on the day of your wedding, we can believe and doubt, right? We can worship and question. Now, here's a story that some of you have heard, but it's very personal for me. When I was in college, I was ill-equipped for Bible college. I didn't really know what I was doing. I went to school, and then especially my junior year and part of my senior year, I think I actually was dealing with some depression. I think to go back, had I seen a counselor, I probably would have been, it would have been concluded that I was dealing with some depression. At the same time, there were some people that were really important to me, to my faith, to my life, that had proved themselves maybe not as trustworthy as I thought. And for those of you who have had that experience, where someone has betrayed you or turned out to be not as reliable as you had thought, that can be really painful, right? It can be really painful. And so I was a good Gen Xer. I was snarky. I was bitter. I was angsty, right? It's a very cool way of saying that. But I was also grieving. And as I said earlier, there were some times when I just didn't believe in God at all. I was also a leader, and that was a difficult place to be in and a time to be in, to be doubting God. You couldn't talk about it. I remember speaking to a friend of mine who somehow just got it that I was serious, but also respected me. And I was like, yeah, I don't know if I believe in God right now. I just don't know. I don't know if he exists. And he respected that, and he kind of talked me back from that a little bit. I don't know what he said, but I am very grateful for my friend Paul. Paul was there for me. He was a friend that could walk through that with me. I went from atheism, is what I was toying with, to deism. Okay, maybe it's hard to explain some things without there being a creative being. It's also intellectually dishonest. You can't really be absolutely sure there's no absolute being. That sort of, how can I know that without knowing everything, which would suggest I may be absolute, so then there doesn't make sense, right? So being agnostic, maybe God exists, maybe he does. Richard Dawkins, it's unlikely. Maybe that's at least intellectually honest. I got there, and I got to deism. But in that space, I was also leading on a Christian campus. I was trying to disciple people. I was going to worship services. And I was right there. I want to believe, but I don't always believe. It was a very sad, doubtful, painful, lonely place. But God was faithful.
Turn your eyes upon Jesus. His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace.
John 3:14-15 reads, "And Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." Son of Man meaning really kind of the man, right? The focal point, what it's been all about. And then John 12:32-33 says similarly, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Here we see that the bronze serpent wasn't really about the serpent, but it was a precursor. It was the trailer. Give you an idea. It was a foreshadowing of Christ. It was the director's fingers bringing the most important element of the story into focus. I think this sheds some light on the serpent story, right? It's a weird story. God could have removed the serpents. That's an answer to that question. He could have not sent them because the serpents weren't there. God sent them. It was a curse. It was a punishment. But he didn't. He did send them. When the Israelites repented, he could have removed them, but he didn't. The fact is that life is full of challenges, pain, enemies, disillusionment, disappointment, hate, and hurt, deep sadness, confusion, and fear, and God doesn't remove them. Instead, he puts himself right in the middle of it so you can see him, right? Build a bronze serpent, make it, and put it in the middle of the camp so when everyone can see me, and when they look to me, I will bring relief. That is the death that Jesus died for us. That serpent wasn't about the serpent. The bronze serpent was about Jesus. Jesus comes, puts himself in the middle of the hate and the fear and the anger and the sadness and the disillusionment and the questions. Father, why have you forsaken me? Take this cup from me. He understands your questions and your doubt and your fear. He understands it. He puts himself in the middle of it. That was the point of the bronze serpent. That is the point of the cross I wear and the worship that I sing, is to put me in touch with, to help me focus on the point. A loving God who put himself in the middle of it all for us. A.W. Tozer said this: "Faith is the gaze of a soul upon a loving God. It isn't clean, it isn't perfect, it doesn't answer all the questions. It's simply saying, Lord, I need you. Are you there? I need you. I'm looking to you. Please help me." Faith is the gaze of a soul upon a saving God. Looking and believing are the same thing. Faith is not tidy. It is not perfect. I can grieve, I can question, and I can worship, and I can follow him. Thomas, Pastor Jim talked about martyrs last week. Thomas, part of why I love him, is he drew the short straw, and he got sent to India. At that time, that would have been the short straw. And as he said, he died by a spear. He was martyred by the king of that state that he was in. There are still many Christians in India that call themselves Thomas Christians, and Thoma is still a popular name. Faith and doubt can coexist. We can question, we can be afraid, and still go for it. I can have cold feet and still say I do. Yeah? Worship, looking to Jesus, comes from a recognition of who he is. And sometimes my circumstances, sometimes my circumstances make it hard to see and believe. But then sometimes those very circumstances make belief easier because they underscore the contrast between who he is and my need. He is what I need. And I see that because there are so many serpents around me. When I was in school and I was going through all this doubt and fear and loneliness, I remember sitting at my desk, and immediately out my window was a parking lot. And so to look past the concrete and the metal, I would kind of look up at this tree. And I would just look at the tree, and it was just something to think about and whatever. That's just what my eyes were drawn to. And one day, the Lord whispered, "Can you make that tree?" What? Can you make that tree? It was the whisper we talked about, the college students from our college and career group, the whisper, "Can you make that tree?" I said, "Well, no. I can plant a tree. I can cut down the tree and I can make something with it, but I can't make a tree." And the Lord said, "Huh." And that was what God used, that tree. It wasn't about the tree. It was about God, a creator God, using something to draw my attention to something bigger. One day, this was fall 1993. I'm going to be incredibly vulnerable here. I've shared this with, I think, one or two other people in my life right around 1993. I was sitting out there by the tree and was moved to write something. And you can make fun of it if you want to, I don't care. But it captured, I think, what God was doing through that experience. I think there are breadcrumbs in lots of our lives, right? That he leaves. They're different for each one of us. Because he's put himself in the middle of us, our lives, but also your life, right? And the things that you need. So here it is. Green to green of lighter shade, lighter than summer's grade, then to yellow, orange, and red, colors varied, now colors shed. Trees once full, now skeletal, obedient to winter's pull, lawns littered with leaves tattered, colors varied, now colors shattered. Green to yellow, orange, and red, colors varied, colors shed. Autumn's work is almost done. Beauty and grace are one. God had used the beauty of the tree to draw me to him. Perhaps looking to Jesus and hearing from Jesus doesn't need to be so difficult. Can you look to Jesus? Can you make a place right now for God to whisper to you, to speak to you now? Kristen and the team are going to lead us in a couple of songs. The altars are open if you want to come. If you want to come, look to Jesus, to make a space for him to whisper. The altars are open. Come and look to Jesus.